The German POWs thought the Americans were mocking them when they saw pancakes, hot coffee, and glass bottles of maple syrup waiting on the breakfast tables that Sunday morning in 1945. Nobody touched the food. One young German woman just stared at the syrup with trembling hands until an American captain quietly said, "It goes on the pancakes." She poured a little, then suddenly burst into tears. The entire tent went silent. Not because of the food, but because it was the first warm breakfast served with kindness she had seen in years. Then she looked up at the captain and spoke perfect English. "You were a teacher before the war, weren't you? Sometimes people do not cry because they are starving. Sometimes they cry because someone finally remembers they are human." The smell reached the women before the soldiers did. Warm butter, fresh coffee, something sweet drifting through the cold spring air like a memory that had no business surviving a war. The German prisoners lifted their heads slowly inside the canvas tent as the morning fog rolled across the muddy ground outside Camp Arlington. It was just after 6 in the morning on a Sunday in April 1945, and nobody understood why the American guards had woken them before sunrise. Usually mornings arrived with metal cups, thin oatmeal, and silence. But this was different. The air itself felt different. Softer somehow. Almost dangerous. Elise Weber stood near the back of the line with her gray wool coat wrapped tightly around her thin frame. The sleeves were slightly too long for her hands. They had belonged to another woman before winter ended. Nothing in the camp was truly yours anymore. Not coats, not names, not even expressions. She watched the other women glance nervously toward the mess hall where warm yellow light spilled across the wet ground. Some whispered under their breath in German. Others avoided looking at the food entirely, as if refusing to hope could somehow protect them from disappointment. Then the doors opened fully, and every woman stopped walking. Long wooden tables stretched across the hall. Real plates, real silverware. White coffee mugs lined in neat rows beside folded napkins. Steam curled into the air from stacks of pancakes nearly 4 inches high, their edges glowing gold beneath hanging lights. Thick slices of bacon crackled somewhere near the kitchen window. Fresh eggs, toast, strawberry jam. And in the center of every table sat small glass bottles filled with amber syrup that caught the morning light like melted sunlight. Nobody moved. One of the younger prisoners blinked several times before whispering, "Is this for the officers?" Another woman shook her head slowly. "No American officer would eat with us." Elise said nothing. Her eyes stayed fixed on the syrup bottles. She had not seen maple syrup in almost 6 years. Not since before ration books, before bomb sirens, before train stations filled with frightened boys pretending not to be afraid. The American soldiers standing near the walls looked almost uncomfortable beneath the silence. Most were young, barely older than the prisoners themselves. One private adjusted his cap nervously while another stared down into his coffee as if he suddenly regretted being there. At the far end of the hall stood Captain Daniel Hayes. Tall, broad shoulders, early 40s maybe. Unlike the younger soldiers, he did not look uncomfortable. He looked observant. Calm blue eyes moved carefully across the room, studying reactions instead of controlling them. He noticed the confusion first, then suspicion, then something harder to describe. A kind of grief that had entered the room disguised as breakfast. "Take your seats," one American sergeant finally said, though even his voice sounded gentler than usual. The women obeyed cautiously. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor. No one spoke above a whisper. Elise sat near the middle of the table across from a girl named Marta whose hands trembled visibly beside her coffee cup. The steam rose between them like smoke from another life. A young American private stepped forward carrying an extra tray of pancakes. "There's more in the kitchen," he said awkwardly. "You don't have to rush." The words landed strangely inside the room. "You don't have to rush." Several women lowered their eyes immediately. One pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. Because hunger had taught everyone to rush. Hunger had taught them to hide bread crusts inside coat pockets. Hunger had taught them to count potatoes like currency. Hunger had taught them that kindness usually arrived with conditions attached. Elise glanced toward the windows where rainwater slid slowly down the glass. Beyond the fences, the world remained gray and broken. Trucks moved in the distance. Soldiers shouted somewhere outside. The war had not magically disappeared overnight. Yet inside this mess hall, for reasons she could not understand, Someone had tried to recreate normal life. And that frightened her more than cruelty ever could. Captain Hayes walked quietly between the tables, saying very little. He nodded once to the cooks near the kitchen entrance before stopping beside the coffee station. Elise noticed his hands first. Steady hands. Teacher's hands, not farmer's hands. There was something careful about the way he moved, as if he had spent years handling books or papers instead of rifles. Then her eyes caught the silver watch around his wrist. An American military-issue watch. Simple leather band. Scratched near the edges. Almost identical to the one her father used to wear while grading school papers late at night beneath a lamp in Berlin. The memory arrived so suddenly it nearly stole her breath. Across the table, Marta finally picked up her fork. "Do we wait?" she whispered. Nobody answered. Then somewhere near the front, one woman slowly poured syrup over her pancakes. The amber liquid spread across the surface in slow golden rivers. Every eye in the room followed the movement. Elise could hear the tiny sound the syrup made as it touched the warm plate. Such a small sound. But in that moment it felt louder than artillery. Another woman lifted her fork. Then another. Slowly, cautiously, the prisoners began eating. Silence filled the hall again. But now it was different. Not fearful. Heavy. Emotional. One bite. That was all it took. A blonde woman near the corner covered her mouth suddenly as tears rolled down her face. Another lowered her head beside her plate. Someone else quietly began crying into her coffee cup without making a sound. No. One mocked them. Not even the soldiers. Because everyone in that room understood something invisible had just broken open. It was not about pancakes. It was not about syrup. It was about sitting at a table without fear for the first time in years. It was about warm coffee arriving before sunrise because someone thought you deserved warmth. It was about napkins folded carefully beside plates when the world outside no longer treated people carefully at all. Elise stared down at her untouched breakfast. The syrup bottle stood inches away from her hand. Captain Hayes noticed immediately. He approached her table without speaking. The room remained wrapped in quiet crying and silverware against porcelain. Finally, he stopped beside her chair. "You haven't eaten," he said softly. Elise looked up at him for the first time. His voice carried no pity. No superiority, just observation. "I'm not very hungry," she replied in careful English. Hayes blinked slightly. Her accent was refined, educated, not what he expected. "You speak English well," he said. Elise glanced toward the syrup bottle again. "My father insisted," she answered. Then, after a pause, she added quietly, "He believed civilized people should understand each other before they destroy each other." For the first time that morning, Captain Daniel Hayes had absolutely no response. Captain Daniel Hayes remained beside the table several seconds after Elise finished speaking, as though her sentence had unsettled something carefully organized inside his mind. Around them, breakfast continued in near silence. The low clink of silverware against porcelain drifted softly through the hall while rain tapped against the windows in uneven rhythms. Somewhere near the kitchen, bacon still crackled on a flat iron grill, but even that sound felt distant now. Elise lowered her eyes toward the untouched pancakes in front of her. She immediately regretted speaking so directly. Years earlier, before the war had stripped conversations down to survival and caution, she might not have noticed such things about people. Hands, watches, voices. But hardship sharpened observation. You learned quickly when silence was safer than speaking. And yet something about this American officer had disturbed her expectations from the moment he entered the room. He did not carry himself like the others. Not arrogant. Not careless. Careful men were dangerous in different ways. Hayes finally spoke again, his tone quieter now. "Your father was a teacher?" Elise nodded once. "History and literature." She paused briefly before adding, "He believed wars begin long before soldiers arrive." The captain glanced toward the rain-covered windows. "Mine taught mathematics." Elise looked up slowly. For the first time that morning, genuine surprise crossed her face. Hayes noticed it immediately. "You did not expect that answer," he said. "No," Elise admitted softly. "Most soldiers do not talk about school." A faint smile almost appeared at the corner of his mouth before disappearing again. Most soldiers were something else before the uniforms. The words settled between them heavily. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just true. Nearby, one of the younger American privates approached with a steaming coffee pot in his hand. "Refill, Captain?" Hayes nodded absently while still watching Elise. The private poured fresh coffee into his mug, then hesitated beside the women's table. "Anyone else?" he asked awkwardly. Marta lifted her cup carefully with both hands. The private filled it nearly to the top before moving down the line. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air again, rich and warm enough to make several women close their eyes for a moment. Elise remembered cafes in Berlin before blackout curtains covered every window in the city. She remembered professors arguing softly over newspapers while cigarette smoke curled towards ceiling fans. She remembered jazz records playing quietly from corner radios. Strange how memory worked. A single smell could resurrect entire streets. Hayes pulled out the empty chair beside her table, but did not sit immediately. "You have not touched the syrup," he observed. Elise looked toward the glass bottle again. Golden liquid caught the overhead lights in soft reflections. "In Germany," she said slowly, "we used to save sugar for Christmas." She stopped there, though both of them understood the rest without explanation. Christmases became smaller, then colder, then quieter. Hayes finally sat down across from her, resting his coffee mug between both hands. Around them, several soldiers pretended not to notice the conversation while clearly listening anyway. "This breakfast was not my idea," he admitted. Elise raised an eyebrow slightly. "No, the camp cook is from Vermont. He argued with the quartermaster for 3 days to get maple syrup shipped down here." Elise glanced toward the kitchen where an older American cook moved between steaming pans with surprising concentration. "Why?" she asked. Hayes leaned back slightly. "Because he said Sunday mornings should feel like Sunday mornings." Elise stared at him for several seconds. Then, despite herself, a quiet breath escaped that sounded dangerously close to laughter. Not because the sentence was funny, because it sounded absurdly normal. Wonderfully normal. Sunday mornings should feel like Sunday mornings. The war had stolen such simple logic from the world years ago. At the far end of the hall, one of the prisoners suddenly began crying harder than before. Not loudly. The woman kept her head lowered beside her plate, shoulders trembling, while another German girl rubbed her back gently. No guards intervened. No one ordered silence. The Americans simply looked away respectfully. Hayes noticed Elise watching the scene. "We almost canceled breakfast this morning," he said quietly. "Why?" "Some officers thought it would create problems." Elise understood immediately. Kindness complicated war. Humanizing people made categories harder to maintain. It was easier to manage prisoners when everyone stayed emotionally distant. Hayes rubbed his thumb slowly against the ceramic coffee mug. One lieutenant said feeding German prisoners pancakes while American families were still rationing butter back home would look weak. Elise remained silent. "And what did you say?" she finally asked. Hayes looked toward the crying woman at the end of the table. "I said hungry people understand hunger better than politicians ever will." Outside, rain continued falling across the muddy camp roads. A military truck rolled slowly past the mess hall windows, tires sinking slightly into wet ground. Somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of a harmonica, one of the younger guards probably playing beneath a supply awning to escape the weather. The sound drifted softly through the morning like an old memory nobody wanted to interrupt. Elise finally picked up her fork. The pancake had grown cooler now, though steam still rose faintly from the center. She cut a small piece carefully, almost formally, then hesitated again before reaching for the syrup bottle. Her fingers stopped halfway there. Hayes noticed. "You think it will disappear if you touch it," he said gently. Elise lowered her eyes. "In war, good things usually do." For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then Hayes reached forward quietly, took the syrup bottle, and set it closer to her plate without saying another word. Such a small gesture, barely noticeable, but Elise suddenly felt pressure building painfully behind her eyes. Not because of the syrup itself, because he had moved it carefully, respectfully, as though her hesitation mattered, as though she mattered. She poured only a little onto the pancake. Amber syrup spread slowly across the warm surface, while the smell of butter rose into the air again. Then she took a bite. The room around her faded almost instantly. Not physically, emotionally. Suddenly, she was 17 years old again, sitting beside her younger brother Lucas inside a crowded Berlin apartment while snow pressed softly against the windows. Her mother humming quietly near the stove. Her father pretending not to notice Lucas stealing extra sugar cubes from the kitchen bowl. Sunday morning sunlight across the tablecloth. Safety. Ordinary life. The memory hit with such force that Elise immediately lowered her head. Hayes looked away at once, giving her privacy without pretending not to understand. Across the room, several other women were quietly crying now too. The soldiers remained silent. One young private near the doorway removed his cap awkwardly and held it against his chest for reasons he probably could not explain even to himself. Elise swallowed slowly before speaking again. Do American soldiers always serve prisoners breakfast like this? Hayes shook his head once. No, then why today? He stared into his coffee for several seconds before answering. Because yesterday one of the women asked the cook if the smell from the kitchen was real bacon. Elise blinked softly. Hayes continued. She sounded surprised that anyone would waste real bacon on prisoners. The captain looked up again, blue eyes tired beneath the overhead lights. After that, nobody in the kitchen could eat comfortably. Silence settled between them once more. Not empty silence. Human silence. The kind that appears when people suddenly realize they have crossed invisible lines without meaning to. Elise looked down at the pancake again, then toward the rain outside the windows. In Germany, she said quietly, before the war, my father used to say civilization is tested by how people behave when they no longer have to be kind. Hayes absorbed the sentence slowly. Then, almost to himself, he replied, maybe that is why so many civilizations fail. The rain continued through most of the morning, turning the camp roads into long ribbons of dark mud beneath the gray April sky. By the time breakfast ended, the women moved slower than usual as they carried their trays toward the kitchen return window. Not because they were full. Most had lived too long with ration portions to feel truly full anymore. It was because something inside the room had changed, and nobody knew how to leave it behind once they stepped back outside. Elise remained seated a little longer than the others, her empty coffee cup resting between both hands while the last traces of warmth disappeared from the ceramic. Around her, American soldiers folded chairs and stacked and used plates with quiet efficiency. No shouting, no mocking, no careless remarks. Even the younger guards seemed strangely subdued, as though they understood they had witnessed something private without fully understanding what it was. Captain Hayes stood near the kitchen doorway speaking softly with the older camp cook from Vermont. The cook gestured toward the nearly empty syrup bottles with a tired satisfaction that almost looked proud. Hayes nodded once before glancing back toward the dining hall. His eyes found Elise immediately. She noticed, then quickly lowered hers again. Across the room, Marta leaned closer and whispered in German, "He keeps watching you." Elise kept her voice calm. "He watches everyone." Marta shook her head faintly. "Not like that." Before Elise could answer, one of the guards announced that the women would return to the textile warehouse after cleanup duty assignments were posted. Chairs scraped softly across the floor as prisoners began filing toward the exit. Outside, cold rain drifted sideways through the camp fences while trucks rumbled in the distance. Elise finally stood and carried her tray toward the return counter. As she passed the kitchen entrance, the older cook looked up from a sink full of dishes. "Did you like the pancakes?" he asked with a thick New England accent. Elise hesitated. The question felt so ordinary that it almost caught her off guard. She nodded politely. "Yes, sir." The cook wiped his hands on a towel. "Good. Because the maple syrup shipment nearly got me court-martialed." A few nearby soldiers chuckled quietly. Elise looked genuinely confused for a moment, which only made the old cook grin wider. "Army regulations," he explained. "Nobody likes paperwork over breakfast food." For the first time since arriving at the camp, Elise smiled without forcing herself to. It was brief, barely visible, but Hayes saw it from across the room, and somehow that small expression affected him more than the tears had. Outside the mess hall, the air felt colder now that the warmth of breakfast was gone. Prisoners wrapped coats tighter around themselves as they crossed the muddy yard toward the warehouse buildings. Rain tapped softly against canvas roofs and supply crates stacked near the fences. Somewhere beyond the guard towers, a train whistle echoed through the distance. Elise walked beside Marta in silence for several moments before Marta finally whispered, "Do you trust them?" Elise looked toward the gray horizon beyond the camp wires. "I do not think trust arrives all at once." Marta frowned slightly. "Then what arrives first?" Elise thought. About the syrup bottle sliding gently across the table toward her hands. "Confusion," she answered quietly. The textile warehouse smelled faintly of damp fabric, dust, and machine oil. Rows of tables stretched beneath hanging lights where prisoners repaired uniforms, blankets, and torn supply bags for the American Army. The work itself was not difficult. Repetitive stitching, sorting cloth, folding inventory. The difficult part was the silence. Most days the women worked quietly because conversation required energy people no longer possessed. But today whispers drifted constantly through the room. About the breakfast, about the coffee, about the strange kindness of American soldiers serving prisoners like guests instead of enemies. Elise sat near one of the side windows repairing a torn wool coat, while rain slid slowly down the glass beside her. Across the room, two younger women quietly argued about whether the breakfast had been staged for propaganda photographs. Another insisted Americans were trying to soften prisoners before interrogation. Fear made people inventive, especially after years of disappointment. Near noon, the warehouse door opened, and Captain Hayes stepped inside carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. Conversation stopped almost immediately. He walked calmly between the rows of tables, checking supply counts while exchanging short words with the supervising sergeant. Elise kept her eyes lowered toward the code in her lap, though she remained aware of every step he took across the wooden floor. Finally, he stopped beside her table. "Miss Weber." She looked up carefully. "Captain." He held out a folded piece of paper. "Your translation request was approved." Elise blinked once in surprise before taking the document. Several days earlier, she had volunteered to assist with translating German letters and civilian paperwork arriving from nearby towns. She had assumed the request disappeared beneath military bureaucracy. "Thank you," she said quietly. Hayes nodded once. "You start tomorrow morning." Nearby prisoners exchanged quick glances. Translation work meant office duty. Indoors. Better conditions. Slightly warmer rooms. Some probably assumed. Favoritism immediately. Elise sensed it too. Hayes seemed to notice as well because his expression sharpened slightly. "The assignment is temporary," he said in an even tone meant for the room as much as for her. "You are qualified because of your English." Elise understood what he was really doing. Protecting her dignity in front of the others. Not elevating her. Not humiliating her. Simply explaining. Again, such a small thing. Yet after years of harsh commands and suspicion, simple fairness felt almost unfamiliar. Hayes glanced toward the coat she was repairing. "You missed a stitch," he observed. Elise looked down immediately. He was right. A loose seam curved near the sleeve lining. She reached for the needle again, slightly embarrassed. Hayes studied the repair work for another second before saying quietly, "My mother used to sew uniforms during the First World War." Elise paused. "Did she?" Every Thursday night at the church basement in Ohio. A faint shadow crossed his face. She complained constantly about Army stitching standards. Elise almost smiled again. Perhaps German stitching standards are stricter. Hayes crossed his arms. "Now that sounds like national pride." "No." Elise replied softly while threading the needle. "Only observation." Rain rattled harder against the warehouse roof for several seconds before easing again. Somewhere deeper inside the building, an old radiator hissed weakly beside stacks of folded blankets. Hayes remained beside the table longer than necessary, not speaking, just watching the prisoners work quietly beneath the hanging lights. Finally he asked, "How old were you when the war started?" Elise kept sewing as she answered. 19. Hayes nodded slowly. "College." She hesitated. "Medical school preparation." "You wanted to become a doctor?" Elise's hand slowed slightly. "My younger brother had asthma. I spent most of my childhood in hospitals with him." Hayes listened carefully. "And after the war began?" Elise tied off the thread carefully before answering. "After the war began, everyone became something else." The sentence stayed suspended between them while rain tapped softly against the windows. Hayes looked toward the women working silently across the warehouse. Some older, some barely adults. None looking like enemies anymore beneath the dull warehouse lights. Just exhausted human beings trying to survive long enough to feel ordinary again. A sudden burst of laughter near the back tables startled everyone briefly. One American private had attempted to carry too many fabric rolls at once and nearly dropped the entire stack across the floor. Even the prisoners smiled faintly as the embarrassed soldier struggled to regain balance. The moment lasted only seconds, but it changed the atmosphere inside the warehouse. Less tense, less divided. Hayes noticed it too. "Strange," he murmured almost to himself. Elise looked up. What is strange? He watched the young private gathering fabric from the floor, while several German women quietly helped him restack the rolls. How quickly people remember how to act human once somebody allows them to. Elise lowered her eyes again. Perhaps people do not forget, she said softly. Perhaps they only become afraid to show it. Hayes looked at her carefully after that. Not as a prisoner. Not as an enemy. As someone intelligent enough to understand the same sadness he carried quietly beneath the uniform. Outside, rain drifted across the camp fences while somewhere beyond the clouds the afternoon sun tried unsuccessfully to break through. The rain finally stopped sometime near evening, though the clouds still hung low above Camp Arlington like heavy wool blankets stretched across the sky. Thin bands of pale sunlight slipped through the gray for only a few minutes before disappearing again behind the distant hills. Inside the women's barracks, damp coats hung beside narrow bunks while the faint smell of wet fabric filled the air. Most evenings followed the same rhythm. Quiet conversations, folded blankets, metal cups of weak coffee substitute handed out before lights dimmed. But tonight felt different. The breakfast still lingered inside the room like a memory nobody knew how to discuss openly. Elise sat on the edge of her bunk near the far wall, carefully brushing loose threads from the sleeve of her coat, while Marta paced slowly nearby. You barely ate dinner, Marta whispered. Elise shrugged faintly. I was not hungry. Marta stopped pacing. You have said that 3 times today. Elise continued brushing the coat without looking up. And each time it was true. Across the barracks, several women quietly traded stories about food they remembered from before the war. Fresh bread from Munich bakeries. Apple cake cooling near kitchen windows. Sunday roast dinners. The conversations sounded almost cautious, as though remembering ordinary life too vividly might somehow make the present harder to survive. One older woman described the smell of cinnamon from a Christmas market she visited years earlier. Another admitted she could no longer remember the taste of real butter clearly. No one laughed much. But for the first time in weeks, people were talking about life instead of endurance. Outside, boots moved across wet gravel as American guards changed evening shifts beneath the guard towers. A harmonica drifted softly through the camp again, somewhere near the supply tents. The same lonely melody from earlier. Slow, thoughtful, almost homesick. Elise listened quietly while staring toward the darkening windows. Her younger brother Lucas used to play harmonica badly inside their apartment when he was nervous before school exams. He only knew 3 songs, and somehow all 3 sounded sadder than they should have. The memory arrived gently this time instead of painfully. That frightened her in a different way. War had taught people to distrust comfort because comfort made grief return. A sudden knock sounded against the barracks door. Several women immediately stiffened from instinct alone. One of the American guards stepped inside, holding a clipboard beneath the yellow overhead lights. Weber, he called. Elise looked up at once. Yes. Captain Hayes wants you at headquarters tomorrow morning at 0700 for translation duty. Several eyes shifted toward her immediately. Not hostile. Curious. Suspicious. Hopeful. All at once. The guard glanced down at the paper again. You will report to the administration office beside the communications building. Elise nodded quietly. Understood. The guard hesitated before leaving, then added awkwardly, and the cook says breakfast starts 15 minutes early tomorrow. A few women exchanged surprised looks after the door closed again. Marta stared at Elise. 15 minutes early? Elise frowned slightly, perhaps because of office assignments. But Marta shook her head slowly. No. Something changed after this morning. Elise did not answer, because deep down she knew Marta was right. Something had changed. Not officially, not politically, humanly. Later that night, after the lights dimmed and most of the barracks settled into exhausted silence, Elise remained awake beneath her blanket listening to the quiet sounds around her. Rainwater dripping from roof edges outside. Soft breathing from nearby bunks. Wind brushing against the wooden walls. Somewhere beyond the fences, an American truck engine rumbled briefly before fading into the distance. She thought about Captain Hayes sitting across from her at breakfast with steam rising from his coffee cup. The strange calm in his voice. The way he listened fully before answering questions. She had met officers before. German officers. Allied officers. Men who treated conversation like territory to control. But Hayes listened like a teacher listening to students solve difficult problems. Careful, patient, searching for meaning instead of advantage. That difference unsettled her more than hostility would have. Because cruelty was predictable, kindness forced people to reconsider things they had locked away for survival. Elise closed her eyes, but sleep arrived slowly. Memories kept surfacing in fragments. Her father grading essays near the apartment window. Lucas laughing while trying to flip pancakes too early in the pan one snowy December morning. Her mother folding napkins carefully even during ration years because she believed small routines protected dignity. Civilization survives through habits, her mother used to say, not speeches. Elise had not thought about that sentence in years. Yet somehow this American camp, with its coffee mugs and folded napkins, had pulled forgotten parts of her life back into reach. Before dawn the next morning, camp sirens sounded softly for morning rotation. Elise woke instantly, already aware of the cold air pressing through the barracks walls. Outside, the storm had passed completely. The sky above Camp Arlington stretched pale blue beneath drifting clouds while sunlight touched puddles across the muddy roads in thin silver reflections. Women slowly prepared for the day beneath weak electric lights. Boots, coats, scarves, silence. But the atmosphere felt lighter somehow after the rain. Elise braided her blonde hair carefully before wrapping her gray coat tighter around herself. Marta watched from the neighboring bunk. "You look nervous." Elise glanced up. "I am." Marta smiled faintly. "Good. It means you are still alive." The comment almost made Elise laugh. Almost. Outside, cool morning air carried the smell of damp earth and wood smoke drifting from the kitchen chimneys. Guards moved between supply buildings while soldiers unloaded crates near the communications office. The camp looked less severe beneath sunlight. Still fenced, still guarded, but less haunted than it had during the storm. Elise followed the gravel path toward headquarters with her hands tucked inside her coat pockets. As she approached the administration building, she noticed something unexpected near the front steps. 2 small flower pots beside the entrance. White daisies, slightly wilted from the rain, but still standing upright in the morning light. Such an unnecessary detail inside a military camp, which was exactly why it caught her attention. Captain Hayes stood just inside the doorway reviewing paperwork with another officer when she arrived. He looked up immediately. "Miss Weber." Elise nodded politely. "Captain." The other officer glanced between them with mild curiosity before excusing himself down the hallway. Hayes stepped aside and motioned toward the office interior. "Come in. It is warmer inside." The administration office smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and cigarette smoke soaked into old wooden furniture. Filing cabinets lined one wall beside stacks of typed reports. A small American flag stood near the communications desk where radios hummed quietly beneath static. Sunlight crossed the room in pale rectangles through the windows. Hayes removed his gloves slowly while speaking. "You will mostly translate civilian records and intercepted letters from nearby towns." Elise nodded once. "I understand." He studied her for a moment before asking, "Did you sleep at all?" The question surprised her enough that she answered honestly, "Not much." Hayes leaned slightly against the desk. "Neither did I." Elise looked at him carefully then. His eyes appeared more tired than yesterday. Not physically exhausted. Thought heavy, like a man carrying too many unfinished thoughts at once. He noticed her observing him and gave a faint smile. "The camp cook made enough pancakes for 300 people yesterday." Elise blinked softly. "There are only 180 women in the camp." "Exactly." For the first time since entering the office, genuine amusement touched his voice. "The soldiers ate pancakes for dinner last night because nobody wanted to throw them away." Elise lowered her eyes briefly, and this time the smile reached her face fully before she could stop it. Hayes watched her carefully, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because after weeks of guarded expressions and quiet survival, seeing someone remember how to smile felt strangely important. The room remained silent for several seconds, except for the soft hum of military radios in the corner. Then Hayes picked up a stack of translated documents and handed them toward her. "There is one more thing," he said quietly. Elise took the papers carefully. "What is it?" Hayes glanced toward the office window where sunlight reflected off puddles outside the camp road. "Some of the officers think yesterday was a mistake." The warmth in the room seemed to shift slightly. Elise stayed still. "And you?" she asked. Hayes looked back at her calmly. I think people become dangerous when they forget the difference between winning a war and losing themselves. The administration office remained quiet through most of the morning except for the soft clicking of typewriter keys and the constant hum of military radios carrying distant voices through static. Elise sat at a small wooden desk near the side window translating civilian documents while pale sunlight moved slowly across the floorboards beneath her chair. Outside, soldiers crossed the camp yard carrying supply crates through drying mud while spring wind pushed clouds across the brightening sky. The storm from yesterday already felt far away, though traces of rainwater still clung to fence wires and puddled beside the barracks. A stack of handwritten German letters rested beside Elise's elbow waiting for translation approval. Most were ordinary things. Mothers asking about missing sons. Shopkeepers requesting inventory permits. Farmers reporting damaged roads or missing livestock after troop movements. Small human problems surviving beneath the enormous machinery of war. That surprised her more than anything. Even with entire nations collapsing around them, people still worried about bread deliveries and broken fences and whether relatives had enough coal for cooking. Civilization did not disappear all at once. It survived in routines. Captain Hayes moved quietly between offices throughout the morning reviewing reports and speaking with radio operators. Every so often Elise became aware of him glancing toward her desk as he passed the doorway. Never intrusive, never lingering long enough to embarrass her. Simply checking, observing. Once, near mid-morning, he paused beside her chair while she translated a handwritten document filled with hurried German cursive. Difficult, he asked softly. Elise exhaled through her nose. The handwriting belongs in prison. Hayes leaned slightly closer to examine the paper. Schoolteacher. Farmer. Elise replied. Which is worse? The corner of his mouth lifted faintly. My father would agree. She looked up briefly. Your father disliked handwriting? He taught algebra to 16-year-old boys for 30 years. He believed bad handwriting was a direct threat to civilization. Elise lowered her eyes toward the document again, but this time she could not fully hide the small smile forming across her face. The strange thing was not that Captain Hayes spoke kindly. It was that he spoke normally, as though they existed outside the war for brief moments inside these office walls, as though two educated adults discussing handwriting was not absurd in a prison camp surrounded by guard towers and military trucks. Near noon, another officer entered the administration building carrying a folder beneath his arm. Taller than Hayes. Younger. Sharp jaw. Perfectly pressed uniform. The kind of man who looked uncomfortable around disorder. He stopped immediately after noticing Elise at the translation desk. This is the German translator? He asked. Hayes nodded calmly. Miss Elise Weber. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly before shifting back toward Hayes. You did not mention she was a prisoner. The room seemed to cool by several degrees. Elise kept her attention on the papers in front of her, though every nerve sharpened instantly. Hayes remained completely calm. That is because her prisoner status is already obvious to everyone in the building. The officer did not smile. Colonel Whitaker asked me to review security procedures after yesterday's breakfast situation. Elise continued translating silently while pretending not to listen. Hayes folded his arms loosely. And some officers are concerned camp discipline is becoming too informal. A radio crackled softly near the communications desk. Somewhere outside, a truck engine started. Hayes spoke evenly. Discipline and decency are not enemies, Lieutenant Brooks. Brooks glanced toward Elise again. Perhaps not, but prisoners should remember they are prisoners. For the first time all morning, Elise stopped writing. The silence inside the office stretched uncomfortably. Hayes looked directly at Brooks now. Miss Weber translates better English than half the officers in this camp. Brooks shrugged once. That still does not make her American. Hayes answered immediately. No, it makes her useful. The response sounded strategic enough to end the conversation without escalating it further. Brooks stared at Hayes another moment before placing the folder onto a nearby desk. Colonel wants the updated inventory reports by 1800. Then he turned and left the office without another word. The door closed sharply behind him. Elise stared quietly at the unfinished translation in front of her while the radios continued humming in the background. Hayes walked slowly toward the window beside her desk. Outside, sunlight flashed briefly across wet gravel roads where soldiers unloaded fuel drums beside the motor pool. Finally, Elise spoke. You should not argue with superior officers because of me. Hayes kept watching the yard outside. I was not arguing. Elise looked up slightly. Then what was it? He slipped his hands into his pockets. Clarification. She studied his expression carefully. There is a difference? A very important one. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Hayes turned toward her desk again. Lieutenant Brooks believes kindness weakens authority. Elise lowered her eyes toward the papers. And you? Hayes rested one hand against the window frame. I think cruelty is usually the easiest option in any system, which means it proves nothing. The sentence settled heavily inside the room. Elise understood immediately that he was not speaking only about prison camps, or armies, or Germany. He was speaking about people, about power, about the choices human beings made when nobody forced them toward decency. Before she could answer, a soft knock sounded at the office door. The older Vermont cook stepped inside carrying a tray with 2 coffee mugs balanced carefully beside a small plate covered with cloth. Peace offering, he announced. Hayes raised an eyebrow. For what? For the terrible pancakes yesterday. Elise looked up in surprise. The old cook pulled back the cloth dramatically, revealing 2 thick slices of apple cake dusted lightly with powdered sugar. Kitchen experiment, he declared proudly. And before anybody complains, yes, I used the emergency cinnamon supply. Hayes shook his head slowly. You are going to start another war with the quartermaster. Worth it. The cook placed one plate beside Elise carefully. You look like somebody who remembers what real desserts taste like. Elise stared at the apple cake for a second too long before answering softly. Not recently. The old cook nodded once as though he understood far more than she said aloud. Then he left the office whistling, quietly to himself. The smell of cinnamon drifted through the room almost immediately. Warm, familiar, human. Elise looked down at the cake while memories pressed unexpectedly against her chest again. Autumn afternoons in Berlin. Her mother peeling apples near the kitchen sink. Lucas stealing powdered sugar from the counter when he thought nobody noticed. The radio playing dance music softly from the living room while rain touched the apartment windows. So many ordinary moments erased by years of fear and exhaustion. Yet somehow one small slice of cake could pull them back with terrifying clarity. Hayes sat across from her with his coffee mug warming his hands. You do not have to eat it immediately, he said quietly, noticing the expression on her face. Elise looked at him carefully. You always notice hesitation. He gave a tired half-smile. Occupational habit. Teacher? She asked. Hayes nodded once. History. Elise blinked softly. Not mathematics? That was my father. He stirred cream slowly into his coffee. I taught high school American history for 11 years before the Army decided I looked more useful in a uniform. Elise stared at him now with genuine curiosity. Suddenly everything made sense. The calm voice, the patience, the way he listened before speaking, the way he explained instead of commanded. You miss it, she said softly. Hayes looked down into the coffee for several seconds before answering. Every day, outside the office windows, sunlight finally broke fully through the clouds for the first time since the storm. Bright reflections shimmered across puddles and fence wires while distant hills emerged green beneath the spring sky. The camp looked almost peaceful from this angle. Almost ordinary. Elise picked up the fork beside the apple cake carefully. My father believed history teachers were dangerous people, she said quietly. Hayes looked amused. Why? Because they remind students that civilizations fail when good people become too comfortable with cruelty. Hayes watched her for a long moment after that. Then, very softly, he replied, Your father sounds like a wise man. Elise lowered her eyes toward the plate again. He disappeared 2 winters ago during an evacuation transfer. Silence entered the office immediately. Not awkward silence. Grieving silence. Hayes did not ask more questions. Did not offer empty sympathy. He simply sat there quietly while sunlight moved slowly across the wooden floor between them. And somehow that restraint felt kinder than words. The days after the storm settled into a strange rhythm inside Camp Arlington. Not peaceful exactly, but softer around the edges. Morning fog drifted low across the fences before sunlight burned it away by mid-morning. And for the first time in months the prisoners began noticing ordinary details again. Birds gathering beside puddles near the barracks. The smell of fresh-cut lumber from a repair crew rebuilding storage sheds near the south fence. The way the American cook whistled old jazz songs whenever he carried trays through the kitchen corridor. Small things. Forgettable things in normal life. But after years shaped entirely by fear and survival, small things started to feel enormous. Elise spent most mornings in the administration office translating civilian reports and handwritten correspondence, while Captain Hayes moved between meetings and inventory inspections throughout the camp. Their conversations remained brief most of the time. Careful, quiet. Yet every day they seemed to understand each other more without needing many words. Sometimes he placed fresh coffee beside her desk without interrupting her work. Sometimes she corrected translation phrasing before official reports reached headquarters. Neither mentioned these gestures aloud. The respect between them grew through silence more than conversation. Late one afternoon, sunlight poured through the administration windows in long golden bands, while radios murmured softly beneath static near the communications desk. Elise sat reviewing transport documents when Hayes entered carrying several folders beneath one arm. He removed his gloves slowly and placed the papers onto the desk beside her. "You missed lunch," he observed. Elise continued reading. "I was finishing the inventory translations." Hayes glanced toward the untouched coffee near her elbow. "And forgetting to eat apparently." She looked up briefly. "You notice everything." Occupational hazard. He loosened the collar of his uniform slightly before moving toward the office window. Outside, soldiers played catch beside the motor pool during a short break, while mechanics worked beneath the raised hood of a transport truck. The sound of distant laughter drifted faintly through the warm afternoon air. Elise watched the soldiers for several seconds before speaking quietly. They seemed very young. Hayes rested one hand against the window frame. "Most of them are. How old are your students back in Ohio?" He smiled faintly without turning around. 16. 17. Same age as half the boys carrying rifles outside. Elise lowered her eyes toward the paperwork again. "That must feel strange." Hayes remained silent for a moment. Then he answered quietly. "The strangest part is realizing how quickly boys become men once the world gives them permission to stop being children." The office grew still again after that. Only the ticking wall clock and distant truck engines disturbed the silence. Elise carefully stacked the completed translations into neat piles before finally asking, "Do you think the war will end soon?" Hayes turned toward her slowly. The question carried more weight than either of them admitted aloud. "I think people are tired enough for it to end," he said carefully. "That is not always the same thing." Elise understood immediately. She had seen enough frightened faces during evacuations and train transfers to know exhaustion alone did not guarantee peace. Sometimes exhausted people simply learned how to continue surviving. Hayes stepped closer to her desk. "You should take a walk before dinner." Elise blinked once. "A walk?" "The camp perimeter path is open for prisoners during daylight work hours now." She looked genuinely surprised. "Since when?" "Since this morning." "Was that your idea?" Hayes gave a small shrug. "Fresh air improves morale." Elise studied him carefully. "That sounds like official military language." "It is." "And the real reason?" He almost smiled again. Human beings were not designed to spend every hour staring at fences. Outside, wind moved softly through the camp flags while late sunlight warmed the muddy roads into pale brown dust. Elise hesitated only briefly before standing from her desk and folding her translation papers neatly into place. "Very well," she said quietly. "I will take a walk." Hayes nodded once toward the door. "Stay inside the marked paths. You Americans always ruin freedom with instructions." The sentence escaped before she could stop herself. For one dangerous second Elise feared she had spoken too casually. But Hayes surprised her by laughing softly beneath his breath. Not loudly, not dramatically, just genuine amusement breaking briefly through the tiredness in his face. "That," he admitted, "is probably true." Outside, the afternoon air felt warmer than it had in weeks. Spring had finally begun pushing winter out of the hills surrounding Camp Arlington. Grass patches appeared between muddy roads, and small white flowers pushed stubbornly through the dirt beside the outer fences. Elise walked slowly along the permitted gravel path near the edge of the camp, while guards watched from a distance without interfering. Beyond the wire fences stretched open farmland touched by golden sunlight. A farmhouse stood nearly half a mile away beside a red barn and a windmill turning lazily in the breeze. Smoke rose from the chimney in thin, pale lines against the sky. Ordinary American life continuing beyond the camp. For several minutes, Elise simply walked in silence, listening to gravel crunch beneath her boots. Somewhere nearby came the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread from the kitchen buildings preparing evening meals. The scent made her unexpectedly emotional again. Not because of hunger, because warm bread belonged to peace in her memories. She stopped briefly near the western fence where sunlight flashed across metal wire in bright reflections. On the other side, a group of American soldiers repaired fence posts damaged during the storm. One of the younger soldiers noticed her standing there and lifted a hand politely in greeting before returning to work. No mocking smile, no suspicious stare, just acknowledgement. Elise looked away quickly, unsettled by how much such a simple gesture affected her now. Beautiful evening. The voice came from behind her. She turned to find Hayes approaching along the gravel path with his uniform jacket folded over one shoulder. Without the jacket, he looked less like an officer and more like what he once had been. A teacher. A tired man in rolled-up sleeves carrying too many responsibilities at once. Elise glanced toward the fading sunlight. In Germany, we would call this weather dangerous. Hayes looked amused. Dangerous. Because people become hopeful when the weather improves. He walked beside her slowly while the breeze moved through nearby trees. Hope is dangerous. Elise kept her eyes forward. Sometimes hope convinces people to survive things that should break them. Hayes considered that carefully. And is that good or bad? She did not answer immediately. Somewhere beyond the fields, a church bell rang faintly through the evening air. I still have not decided, she admitted quietly. They continued walking side by side, without speaking for several moments. The camp behind them seemed strangely distant beneath the golden light. Just silhouettes of fences and guard towers against the hills. Finally, Hayes spoke again. Lieutenant Brooks filed another complaint this morning. Elise sighed softly. About me? About the breakfast. She looked toward him carefully. And what happened? Hayes glanced down at the gravel path beneath their feet. Colonel Whitaker asked whether I was trying to run a prison camp or a church social. Elise almost smiled despite herself. And what did you say? Hayes looked out across the fields glowing beneath sunset. I said hungry people are easier to manage after pancakes. Elise laughed quietly before she could stop herself. The sound surprised both of them. Not because it was loud, because it sounded natural. Human. For one brief moment, the war disappeared completely between them. No uniforms. No prisoner numbers. No fences. Just two exhausted people walking beneath a spring sunset, trying to remember what ordinary conversation felt like. Hayes heard it too. The laugh. Soft and brief and real. He looked at her differently. Afterward. Not with pity. Not even with sympathy. With recognition. As though he had just witnessed proof that some essential part of her still survived beneath the exhaustion. The wind shifted gently across the hills, carrying the distant smell of rain from somewhere beyond the valley. Evening shadows stretched longer across the gravel road as the sun lowered behind the trees. Elise slowed her steps slightly. Captain Hayes. Yes. She looked toward the fading horizon instead of at him. Do you know what frightened me most about the breakfast? He waited quietly. Elise folded her hands together against the cool breeze. Not the kindness. She paused briefly. The fact that I remembered exactly who I used to be before all of this. Hayes did not answer immediately. The last sunlight touched the fences behind them in pale gold lines, while somewhere inside the camp a dinner bell rang softly through the evening air. Finally, he spoke in a voice so quiet it almost disappeared into the wind. Maybe remembering is the first step home. The next Sunday arrived with clear skies over Camp Arlington and a cold breeze carrying the smell of pine trees from the hills beyond the fences. Morning sunlight spread slowly across the gravel roads while soldiers moved between barracks with steaming coffee cups in their hands. Somewhere near the kitchen building, metal pans clattered loudly enough to wake half the camp before sunrise. By 6 o'clock, prisoners were already whispering quietly inside the women's barracks. Not because of fear this time. Because everyone remembered what had happened the previous Sunday. Elise sat on the edge of her bunk, fastening the buttons of her gray coat, while Marta watched her carefully from across the narrow aisle. You think they will do it again? Marta asked softly. Elise tied back a loose strand of blonde hair before answering. I do not know. Marta smiled faintly. You hope they will. Elise paused for only a second. Yes, she admitted quietly. The truth unsettled her more than she wanted to admit aloud. Hope had returned to the camp slowly over the past week. In small ways. Guards speaking less harshly. Soldiers offering extra blankets. During cold nights without pretending not to care. The cook adding cinnamon to oatmeal one morning because, according to him, people deserve flavor. Tiny gestures, almost meaningless from a distance. Yet inside the fences they changed the atmosphere more than speeches ever could. Outside, a bugle echoed softly across the camp, while pale morning fog drifted low near the guard towers. Elise stepped into the cold air beside the other women as they followed the familiar path toward the mess hall. This time the silence felt different. Less fearful, more uncertain. Like people approaching something precious they were afraid to lose. Near the front entrance, several American soldiers stood carrying trays through the kitchen doors while warm light spilled onto the wet ground outside. Then the smell reached them. Fresh pancakes again. Coffee. Bacon. Maple syrup. Marta closed her eyes briefly. "My God," she whispered in German. Elise felt something tighten painfully in her chest before she even stepped inside. The tables looked almost identical to last Sunday. White mugs, folded napkins, glass syrup bottles glowing beneath the hanging lights. But there was one small difference this time. Someone had placed tiny vases with wildflowers along the center of each table. Daisies and bluebells gathered from fields beyond the camp. Simple flowers in plain glass jars. Elise stopped walking for half a second after noticing them, because flowers inside a prison camp felt almost impossible. Captain Hayes stood near the coffee station speaking quietly with the Vermont cook when he noticed the women entering the hall. His eyes moved across the room automatically until they found Elise near the doorway. No smile, no dramatic reaction, just quiet recognition. The kind shared between people who had already said important things without speaking much at all. "Good morning," the cook announced loudly from behind the serving line. "And before anybody complains, yes, I made extra pancakes this time." A few nervous laughs moved softly through the hall. Even some of the American soldiers smiled. The tension from last week had faded slightly now that everyone understood the breakfast was not a mistake or performance. It had become something stranger. A tradition. Elise sat beside Marta near the middle table while sunlight streamed through the windows in long golden beams across the wooden floor. Outside, birds moved along the muddy yard collecting scraps near the fence line. Everything looked painfully ordinary, which somehow made it emotional again. An American private approached carrying a fresh coffee pot. Younger than most. Freckles across his face. Nervous smile. "Coffee, ma'am?" he asked awkwardly. Elise blinked softly at the word ma'am. Not prisoner. Not German. Ma'am. She lifted her mug quietly while he filled it nearly to the top. Steam curled upward between them. "Thank you," she said. The private nodded quickly and moved on, embarrassed by his own politeness as though kindness itself still surprised him. Near the front of the hall, Lieutenant Brooks entered through the side door, carrying several folders beneath one arm. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Soldiers straightened slightly. Conversations lowered. Brooks stopped after seeing the decorated tables, and his expression hardened at once. He walked directly toward Hayes near the kitchen entrance. Elise could not hear the beginning of the conversation, but she noticed Hayes fold his arms calmly while Brooks gestured sharply toward the flowers and breakfast tables. The Vermont cook suddenly became very interested in rearranging syrup bottles nearby. Marta leaned closer toward Elise. "That officer hates this." Elise kept her eyes on the coffee cup in front of her. "No," she replied quietly. "I think he fears it." Across the room, Brooks lowered his voice further while Hayes listened without interruption. Finally, the lieutenant gestured toward the prisoners themselves before saying something that visibly tightened the older cook's jaw beside them. Hayes answered immediately. Calm, even, but firm enough that Brooks stepped back slightly afterward. Then Hayes said something else that Elise could not hear. Whatever it was caused silence between the two officers for several seconds. Brooks stared across the room toward the women seated at the breakfast tables. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the hall. The door shut sharply behind him. The cook released a long breath through his nose. Hayes picked up a tray of coffee mugs as though nothing unusual had happened. But Elise noticed the exhaustion in his face from across the room. She understood now that kindness carried a cost here too. Not everyone inside the camp believed prisoners deserved reminders of humanity. Breakfast continued quietly afterward. The women ate slowly while sunlight warmed the room brighter with every passing minute. One of the younger prisoners began humming softly beneath her breath near the far table. Not loudly enough to attract attention, just absent-mindedly. A tune from before the war, perhaps. Nobody stopped her. Elise reached for the syrup bottle beside her plate. This time her hands did not shake. She poured carefully while watching amber liquid spread across the pancakes in golden lines. Then she noticed something folded beneath the edge of her napkin. A small handwritten note. Her heartbeat quickened slightly as she unfolded it beneath the table. The handwriting was familiar now. Steady. Careful. The flowers were the cook's idea. The daisies were mine. No signature. None needed. Elise stared at the note for several seconds while noise around the hall faded into distant blur. Then slowly, almost without realizing it, she looked toward Hayes near the coffee station. He was speaking with one of the radio operators while holding a steaming mug in both hands. Tired eyes, rolled sleeves, teacher's posture even inside the uniform. At that exact moment, as though sensing her gaze somehow, Hayes looked up too. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded mess hall. Nothing dramatic happened. No smile. No gesture. But Elise suddenly understood something that frightened her more than hope ever had. The camp was beginning to feel less like a place built entirely around survival. And once people started feeling human again, losing that feeling became unbearable. A chair scraped suddenly near the far end of the hall. One of the younger prisoners stood quickly, embarrassed after accidentally knocking over her coffee cup. Hot coffee spread across the floor. Beside the table, while several women jumped back instinctively. Before any guard could react, an American soldier nearby grabbed extra towels and knelt beside the spill immediately. "You are all right," he said gently while helping clean the mess. It was only coffee. Only coffee. Elise stared at the scene quietly. Years ago such a sentence would have meant nothing. Now it sounded extraordinary. Because nobody shouted. Nobody humiliated the girl. Nobody treated her fear like weakness. The soldier simply cleaned the spill as though helping another human being was the most normal thing in the world. Hayes watched the moment too from across the room. Then he noticed Elise watching it. The sunlight through the windows caught the steam rising from the coffee cups while the smell of pancakes and maple syrup filled the hall again. And somewhere beneath all those ordinary details, something invisible shifted quietly inside Camp Arlington. Not politics. Not war. Something smaller. And perhaps far more dangerous. People were beginning to remember how to care about each other. By the middle of April, spring had fully arrived in the hills around Camp Arlington. The muddy roads dried into pale brown dust beneath warm afternoon sunlight, and the trees beyond the fences carried fresh green leaves that moved softly whenever wind crossed the valley. Even the camp itself seemed changed by the season. Prisoners spent more time outside during work assignments. Soldiers removed heavy jackets during daytime patrols. Somewhere near the kitchen building, someone had started planting vegetables beside the supply shed using old ration crates as garden boxes. Tiny signs of ordinary life continued appearing where nobody expected them. Elise noticed all of it. She noticed because she had started looking at the world again instead of merely surviving inside it. Every morning, she crossed the gravel path toward the administration office carrying translation folders against her chest, while American soldiers greeted her with small nods instead of suspicious silence. Some still avoided conversation entirely. Others remained cautious around the prisoners. But the atmosphere inside the camp had shifted in ways impossible to reverse completely. Once people remembered how to treat each other like human beings, cruelty began looking strangely unnecessary. That frightened certain officers more than anything. Late one afternoon, Elise sat near the office window translating supply records while warm sunlight filled the room in golden squares across the floorboards. Captain Hayes stood beside the communications desk reviewing inventory forms with tired concentration when the office door opened sharply. Lieutenant Brooks entered carrying another stack of reports beneath one arm. Unlike the peaceful mood outside, Brooks looked increasingly irritated these days. His uniform remained perfect, his posture sharp, yet something restless had entered his expression over the past week, as though the softening atmosphere around the camp personally offended him. He placed the reports onto Hayes's desk harder than necessary. "Colonel Whitaker wants the prisoner conduct review finalized by tomorrow morning." Hayes did not look up immediately. "It will be finished tonight." Brooks glanced toward Elise, translating papers near the window. I see the secretary is still here. The sentence landed coldly inside the office. Elise kept writing without reacting outwardly, though her grip tightened slightly around the pen. Hayes slowly set down the document in his hands before speaking. Miss Weber is translating supply manifests. Brooks shrugged faintly. Still a prisoner. Hayes met his eyes calmly. Still human. Silence settled instantly between them. Even the radio operators near the communications desk stopped moving for half a second. Brooks gave a short, humorless laugh beneath his breath. You know what your problem is, Captain? Hayes folded his arms quietly. Please enlighten me. Brooks stepped closer to the desk. You are forgetting why this camp exists. Outside the open window came the distant sound of soldiers laughing near the motor pool. Someone hammered boards together beside the south fence repair site. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. Yet inside the office tension tightened invisibly through the air. Hayes remained calm. This camp exists because the war created prisoners. Brooks shook his head sharply. No. This camp exists because the enemy lost. Elise lowered her eyes toward the papers in front of her, but every word reached her clearly. Hayes studied Brooks carefully before answering. And what exactly are we supposed to win afterward? Brooks stared at him in disbelief. This is exactly what I mean. Pancake breakfasts. Flowers on tables. Walk privileges. You are turning a prison camp into a boarding school. Hayes finally stepped away from the desk. His voice never rose. Somehow that made it stronger. No. I am preventing frightened people from becoming cruel out of habit. Brooks crossed his arms. They are Germans. Hayes answered immediately. They are women. The room fell silent again. Outside the office windows, sunlight moved gently through the leaves of nearby trees, while spring wind carried the smell of cut grass across the yard. Elise suddenly understood something important. This argument had been happening long before her arrival. Not just between these two men. Everywhere. In every uniform. In every country. A battle between people who believed suffering justified more suffering and people who still believed humanity mattered even after war stripped everything else away. Brooks looked toward Elise briefly before turning back to Hayes. You know what soldiers are saying about you. Hayes seemed almost tired now. I imagine you are about to tell me. They think you care more about these prisoners than your own men. Elise looked up immediately. Hayes did not react at first. Then very quietly he asked, Have you spoken to my men yourself? Brooks hesitated slightly. That is not the point. It is exactly the point. Hayes stepped closer now, blue eyes steady beneath the afternoon light. The soldiers under my command are eating better, sleeping better, fighting less, drinking less. Do you know why? Brooks remained silent. Hayes answered anyway. Because decent environments produce decent behavior. The lieutenant shook his head. You sound like a professor. A faint shadow crossed Hayes's face. I was. That answer changed something in the room. Brooks looked away first. Not defeated, just unable to fully understand the man standing in front of him. To Brooks, war simplified people into categories. Allies, enemies, orders, discipline. But Hayes carried his old life inside the uniform still. Teacher, father perhaps someday, citizen, human being. The war had not erased those things completely. And because of that, he saw prisoners differently. Brooks finally gathered the remaining folders from the desk. Colonel Whitaker wants stricter regulations by next week. Hayes nodded once. Then I will speak with him directly. Brooks paused at the doorway before leaving. You cannot save everyone, Captain. Hayes looked toward the sunlight outside the windows instead of at him. That was never the assignment. The door shut behind Brooks a moment later. Silence filled the office once again except for the soft crackling of radio static near the communications desk. Elise slowly placed her pen down beside the translated papers. Hayes remained standing near the center of the room with one hand resting against the back of a wooden chair. For the first time since she met him, he looked truly exhausted. Not physically, morally, as though carrying kindness through a war required more strength than people realized. Elise stood carefully from her desk. Captain Hayes. He looked up slowly. Yes. She hesitated before speaking because the words felt dangerous in ways she could not fully explain. You should not have to defend basic decency so often. A faint, tired smile touched his face. History suggests otherwise. She walked closer to the office window where sunlight reflected softly across the glass. Outside, Soldiers unloaded supply crates while one of the younger guards shared a cigarette with the Vermont cook near the kitchen entrance. Ordinary scenes. Peaceful scenes. Yet all of it depended on people choosing restraint every single day. Hayes stepped beside her quietly. Do you know something strange? Elise glanced toward him. What? Before the war, I spent years teaching students about civilizations collapsing. He folded his arms loosely while watching the yard outside. Most of them assumed societies fail because of dramatic moments. Revolutions. Battles. Political speeches. Elise listened carefully. Hayes shook his head faintly. But civilizations usually disappear through smaller decisions. His voice lowered slightly. People becoming comfortable with treating others as less human. Outside, wind moved gently through the camp flags while somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Another spring storm approaching. Elise stared through the office window for several seconds before asking quietly, "And what preserves civilization?" Hayes looked at her then. Not at the prisoner uniform. Not at the war. At her. Small decisions, too. The answer settled deeply inside her chest. Because suddenly she understood the pancakes. The flowers. The coffee refills. The walk paths. The folded napkin with daisies written in careful handwriting. None of it was accidental. Hayes was fighting a different kind of battle inside the camp. A quiet battle against the idea that war gave people permission to stop being decent. A radio operator suddenly approached from the communications desk carrying a telegram form. Captain, headquarters just confirmed transfer schedules from the eastern camps. Hayes took the document immediately. His expression changed slightly as he read the first lines. Elise noticed at once. Bad news? She asked softly. Hayes looked toward her carefully before folding the telegram closed. Not bad. He paused briefly. Complicated. Outside, thunder rolled again somewhere beyond the valley while sunlight still lingered stubbornly across the camp roads. Storm and sunlight existing together above Camp Arlington at the exact same moment.